January 14, 1945. The Rhine Valley shivers under a layer of cold mist. The fields below are scarred with tank tracks and the blackened skeletons of trucks abandoned in the mud. Dawn has barely touched the horizon when a deep metallic roar slices through the silence. It's not a bomber. It's a P-47 Thunderbolt, heavy, brutal, and utterly alive. The German soldiers on the road look up, expecting another distant flyby from the toy planes their officers once mocked. But the sound grows. A hurricane of pistons and propellers shriek. Then the sky erupts. 8 Browning .50 caliber guns unleash a storm that tears through the convoy like a chainsaw through dry wood. In seconds, fire and smoke swallow the road. The pilot banks away, vapor trails curling from his wings, sunlight glinting off the steel-gray fuselage. The laughter of the Reich's commanders had long since faded. The Jug, once dismissed as too big, too slow, too American, had become the hunter of the hunters, the scourge of the Luftwaffe. The age of air superiority had changed, forever. When the Second World War erupted in 1939, the German Luftwaffe stood as a symbol of speed, precision, and tactical brilliance. Its Messerschmitt Bf 109s and, later, Focke-Wulf Fu 190s ruled Europe's skies. These aircraft embodied the German approach to air warfare, sleek, agile, designed for rapid strikes, and intimately tied to the Blitzkrieg doctrine that shattered Poland and France in months. The Luftwaffe's pilots were confident, trained in the crucible of Spain and Poland, their machines light and lethal. To them, air combat meant finesse, not brute force. Across the Atlantic, the United States lagged behind. Its Army Air Corps, though ambitious, was burdened by interwar budgets and outdated concepts. In 1940, American fighters like the P-36 Hawk and P-40 Warhawk seemed primitive compared to German designs. But within the workshops of Republic Aviation in Farmingdale, Long Island, a new philosophy was taking shape. Chief designer Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian immigrant, believed survival and power mattered more than elegance. His aircraft would not dance, it would endure. From that belief would emerge a beast of metal and fire, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. The early design lineage came from Republic's earlier attempts. The P-35 and the P-43 Lancer, each was a step towards something stronger, something that could survive in the brutal new air war unfolding overseas. By 1941, as Europe burned and Britain clung desperately to survival, the U.S. demanded a fighter that could escort bombers, climb to high altitudes, and deliver punishment without fear of disintegration. Kartveli responded with an audacious concept. A single-seat fighter powered by the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, coupled to a complex turbo supercharger system that would give it power even above 25,000 feet. The result would be enormous, nearly 8 tons when loaded, heavier than some twin-engine aircraft. When the prototype first appeared, many within the U.S. Army Air Forces were skeptical. It was too big, they said, too heavy. How could such a brute dogfight against agile German fighters? Even the British, who would later receive some under Lend-Lease, doubted its worth. But Kartveli's design defied expectations. The engine's raw strength, the armor plating, and the aircraft's sheer mass gave it something rare in that era: resilience. By mid-1942, the P-47B began to roll off production lines, and by early 1943, the first Thunderbolts crossed the Atlantic to join the 8th Air Force in England. At that time, America's daylight bombing campaign was just beginning. The strategy, precision bombing in daylight, depended on one fragile assumption: that tight bomber formations, armed with machine guns, could fend off enemy fighters. The first missions shattered that illusion. B-17s and B-24s fell from the sky in burning spirals as the Luftwaffe tore through their defensive circles. The losses were unsustainable. The U.S. needed a true escort fighter, fast, long-ranged, and deadly. The P-47 entered combat in April 1943. Early missions were plagued by teething issues, unreliable radios, engine problems, and limited range. The Thunderbolt could barely reach the Ruhr and return. Pilots of the 4th Fighter Group and 56th Fighter Group, among the first to fly the Jug, learned its temperament the hard way. The massive engine took time to spool up, the turbocharger lagged, and its takeoff roll seemed endless. Yet once airborne, the aircraft revealed its true nature. In a dive, it was unmatched. Its weight became an advantage, allowing it to plunge through the sky at over 500 miles per hour without tearing itself apart, something few fighters could do. The Germans soon encountered it. At first they mocked it. A flying milk jug, a bomber with one engine. But when the first P-47s began to engage at altitude, their laughter turned to unease. The Jug's 8 50 caliber machine guns could shred an enemy aircraft in a single pass. It could take hits, keep flying, and return home riddled with holes. Slowly, a new kind of respect and fear began to take root among Luftwaffe pilots. By the end of 1943, the P-47 was evolving from a high-altitude escort to something more, a weapon of domination. Its pilots learned to fight in vertical dives, to strike and climb before the enemy could react. Yet the war was far from decided, and over Europe, the battle for control of the air had only just begun. By 1944, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had evolved from an experimental giant into a frontline war machine, one that symbolized the American way of engineering: durable, powerful, and adaptable. Beneath its thick aluminum skin roared the Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, a mechanical monster of 18 cylinders producing over 2,000 horsepower. Feeding it was a complex turbo-supercharger system, whose exhaust ducts wound through the aircraft's fuselage like veins of steel. The system kept the engine breathing at high altitude, allowing the Jug to climb above 30,000 feet, where the air was thin, and the Luftwaffe once reigned supreme. The price of this power was weight, over 8 tons fully loaded, but that same weight made it one of the most resilient aircraft ever built. Each P-47 carried 8 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing. Together they could pour more than 3,400 rounds per minute, turning any target below into shredded wreckage. When the Thunderbolt arrived over France or Germany, the earth trembled with its firepower. Pilots often described the experience as unleashing a flying battleship. It was not graceful, but it was devastating. The aircraft could dive faster than any Allied or Axis fighter of its time, up to 550 miles per hour, and its sturdy frame absorbed hits that would tear lighter planes apart. Pilots joked that if a P-47's engine quit, it could still glide to England on sheer momentum. At first, its large size and short range limited its role to high-altitude escort work over northern France and the Low Countries. But innovation followed necessity. Engineers fitted it with drop tanks, auxiliary fuel canisters slung beneath the wings, extending its operational range deep into Germany. Now bomber crews over the Ruhr and Hamburg could count on fighter cover for more of their journey. For the first time, German interceptors found themselves hunted even over their own airfields. The Luftwaffe, once master of the skies, was entering decline. Years of attrition, fuel shortages, and the loss of veteran pilots had hollowed its ranks. Allied intelligence networks and radar coverage tightened across occupied Europe, while the Thunderbolt's arrival added a new layer of menace. Fighter groups like the 56th Thunderbolt, nicknamed Zemke's Wolf Pack after their leader Colonel Hubert Zemke, became legendary. They refined tactics to exploit the Jug's strengths: vertical energy fighting, diving attacks, and coordinated squadron sweeps. Instead of turning duels, they used altitude and speed: hit hard, pull up, reform, and strike again. The Wolfpack's growing list of aces told the story. Francis Gabby Gabreski, Robert S. Johnson, and Dave Schilling, names that would become synonymous with the Thunderbolt, each carved their legend in the cold air above occupied Europe. Their kills mounted not from luck but discipline, tactics, and a machine that could take punishment and still return home. As 1943 turned to 1944, the P-47's mission began to evolve. When not escorting bombers, Thunderbolt squadrons swept low over roads, trains, and supply depots. Their 8 guns ripped through columns of trucks, locomotives, and fuel dumps, crippling German mobility. The Jug's rugged construction allowed it to shrug off small arms fire and flak that would down lighter aircraft. Soon, the P-47 was not just a fighter, it was a weapon of air supremacy and ground destruction. German troops who once laughed at its bulk learned to fear its shadow. The technological shift was mirrored by a psychological one. The Luftwaffe's command structure, once confident, began to waver as their elite units suffered under relentless American pressure. The belief that Germany's fighters could dominate the European theater crumbled under the weight of industrial might and relentless adaptation. By the time of the Normandy landings in June 1944, the P-47 was a cornerstone of Allied air power. Its roar signaled not only protection for the bombers above, but death for anything that moved below. The German front lines, already strained by ground losses, now faced annihilation from the sky. The toy plane had become the hammer of retribution. The skies over Europe had turned into a battlefield of technology, courage, and endurance. And the Jug was at the center of it all. What came next was not merely combat, but evolution, the convergence of man, machine, and strategy that would change the nature of air warfare forever. For the young American pilots who crossed the Atlantic in 1943, the P-47 Thunderbolt was both a monster and a mystery. Many had come from light trainers, nimble, forgiving aircraft that responded gently to control. The Jug was different. It was massive, heavy on the stick, and roared with the fury of 18 cylinders. When they first opened the throttle, the sheer torque could twist the plane down the runway. Yet once airborne, it felt like stepping inside a fortress. The cockpit was roomy, protected by armor plates and a bulletproof windscreen. The men quickly learned that survival meant mastering patience. The Thunderbolt did not win through quick turns or daring stunts. It demanded discipline, altitude first, speed second, accuracy always. Training missions over England's gray skies often ended in silence. Some aircraft never returned. Oxygen systems froze at 25,000 feet, radios failed, engines overheated. But slowly, methodically, the pilots adapted. They learned how to coax the turbo supercharger into life, how to dive without losing control, how to climb back into formation with fuel gauges sinking to zero. Each lesson was earned in sweat and fear. When combat came, they discovered the aircraft's true gift: resilience. Even after flak shredded their wings or shells tore through their fuselage, the P-47 could limp home. Many pilots owed their lives to its thick armor and massive radial engine. It became more than a plane. It was a trusted companion, a machine that brought its pilot home when physics said it shouldn't. The heart of the Thunderbolt was its engineering. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine was not just powerful. It was a symbol of America's industrial depth. Paired with a turbo supercharger mounted behind the cockpit, connected by a maze of ducts and intercoolers, it gave the P-47 unprecedented high-altitude performance. While most fighters gasped for air above 25,000 feet, the Jug still climbed, its engine howling through the thin stratosphere. The turbo system recycled exhaust gases to compress intake air, an innovation that turned waste into horsepower. But this complexity came at a price. Maintenance crews called the P-47 a plumber's nightmare. The ducts, valves, and pipes demanded constant inspection, and a single leak could rob the engine of its strength. Yet once understood, it offered unmatched reliability. The combination of robust construction and mechanical precision meant the Thunderbolt could fly longer, fight harder, and survive hits that would cripple lighter machines. It was not designed for elegance. It was designed for war. The massive airframe also carried enormous fuel and ammunition reserves. With drop tanks, its range stretched farther than ever imagined for such a heavy fighter. Engineers discovered that what began as a defensive escort could easily transform into an offensive juggernaut. Bomb racks, rocket rails, and reinforced wings turned it into a multi-role platform, years before the term even existed. In an age where speed and maneuver were worshipped, the P-47 redefined power itself. To the Luftwaffe's analysts, the first reconnaissance photos of the P-47 were almost amusing. Its barrel-like fuselage, broad wings, and size suggested sluggishness. They believed it would be no match for the nimble Messerschmitt Bf 109 or the sleek Focke-Wulf FW 190. German intelligence dismissed it as too big for a fighter, too small for a bomber. Luftwaffe commanders even joked that the Americans had built a flying milk can. That arrogance would cost them dearly. When the first combat encounters occurred in mid-1943, German pilots found themselves on the receiving end of a new kind of battle. The Thunderbolt refused to turn and dogfight. Instead, it came screaming down from above, a silver blur that unleashed 8 streams of tracers before vanishing skyward again. Its diving speed was phenomenal. The FW-190s, once the terror of the Western Front, could not follow without tearing their wings apart. Then came the ground attacks. As the Luftwaffe struggled to defend both skies and supply lines, the Thunderbolt struck rail yards, convoys, and airfields with growing precision. Flak batteries tried to adapt, but the P-47's armor shrugged off near misses that would obliterate other fighters. German morale began to fracture. Reports from frontline units described the Jug as invulnerable and relentless. To the soldiers on the ground, its thunderous dive and the staccato roar of 8 Brownings became the sound of doom. The early laughter had turned to dread. The Luftwaffe's high command, once certain of technological superiority, now faced a machine that symbolized everything Germany could no longer match: raw industrial power, mechanical endurance, and endless production. The Thunderbolt was not merely an aircraft, it was the physical embodiment of American escalation. By late 1943, the skies over Europe were no longer just a contest of pilots, they were a contest of philosophies. German precision met American mass, and the Jug stood as proof that brute force, when refined by engineering, could outlast brilliance. The underdog of 1942 had become the avenger of 1944, and the Reich's hunters were beginning to realize that they had become the hunted. The P-47 was never meant to twist and turn in the tight spirals of a dogfight. Its strength lay in energy, altitude, momentum, and speed. Pilots of the Thunderbolt learned to fight in the vertical plane, not the horizontal. Their doctrine was simple: climb high, strike fast, and never linger. They called it boom and zoom. At 30,000 feet, the Jug would dive like a thunderbolt, hence its name, accelerating to nearly 500 miles per hour as it screamed toward the target. The enemy had seconds to react before 8 streams of 50 caliber rounds tore through aluminum and flesh. Then, with its immense power, the P-47 would pull up, leaving German fighters stalled and vulnerable below. Colonel Hubert Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, formalized this doctrine. He taught his men to use altitude as ammunition, to think of energy as life. His famous Zemke fan tactic, spreading formations across a wide area to surprise enemy interceptors, turned chaos into control. The Luftwaffe, accustomed to facing tight Allied formations, struggled against this flexibility. Instead of meeting a predictable wall of escorts, they found themselves isolated, ambushed, and outmaneuvered by pilots who dictated when and where to fight. The Jug's strength was not agility, it was choice. It could decide the terms of battle, and that made it lethal. Even its flaws became tools. The slow climb rate that frustrated early pilots forced them to plan ahead, to think strategically. They learned to use the aircraft's dive speed as escape, its armor as security. And when combat descended to lower altitudes, over Normandy, over the Ardennes, the Thunderbolt's mass turned it into a battering ram from the heavens. Leadership in the P-47 units was as rugged as the aircraft itself. Hubert Zemke, Francis Gabby Gabreski, and Robert S. Johnson were more than aces. They were architects of a new kind of aerial warfare. Zemke's analytical mind and unshakable calm made him a mentor to hundreds of young flyers. He believed discipline saved lives, not bravado. Gabreski, on the other hand, embodied raw aggression. He flew like a predator, using every ounce of the Jug's power to dominate his enemies. Johnson, who once brought his riddled Thunderbolt home with over 200 bullet holes, became a living legend of resilience. Each man, in his own way, defined what the P-47 stood for: determination, endurance, and overwhelming force. Their leadership forged unity among the fighter groups. Pilots knew that their commanders led from the front, that they shared the same dangers, the same frostbitten hands gripping the same throttles. Zemke's Wolfpack became the most successful P-47 unit in the war, credited with over 665 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air. The name itself spread through German channels like a curse. To be attacked by the Wolfpack meant almost certain death. But leadership wasn't only in the cockpit. Ground crews, thousands of engineers, armorers, and mechanics, formed the invisible backbone of the Thunderbolt's success. They worked in sleet and darkness, patching bullet holes, changing engines, loading ammunition. Every sortie was a testament not just to pilot skill, but to the unseen army that kept these machines alive. It was collective discipline, an industrial kind of heroism, that allowed the Jug to dominate. By 1944, the Thunderbolt had transformed into more than a fighter. It had become a weapon of annihilation. Its ability to carry bombs, rockets, and machine guns turned it into a flying artillery platform. Each mission into France or Germany was not merely combat, it was destruction on an industrial scale. Rail lines, bridges, trucks, fuel convoys, nothing was safe. Pilots who once dreamed of dueling enemy fighters now spent their days strafing trains or columns of soldiers. The exhilaration of aerial victory was replaced by something colder: efficiency. The shift took a toll. Many pilots spoke later of the moral weight of their missions. Strafing a truck convoy meant facing men who often had no chance to fight back. The smell of burning fuel and flesh followed them home. Yet they also understood the necessity. Every destroyed locomotive delayed German reinforcements. Every bomb dropped on a rail yard weakened the Reich's ability to resist. Total war allowed no illusions. The Thunderbolt was not designed for mercy. It was designed for victory. To the soldiers on the ground, the Jug's scream meant death, but to the Allied troops advancing below, it meant salvation. Its presence turned the tide of countless battles, shielding columns from ambush, clearing skies for bombers, and breaking the enemy's will to move by day. The P-47's legacy, then, was not only one of triumph, but of transformation, from a misunderstood giant to the embodiment of air power's brutal logic. And as the war pressed deeper into German soil, that logic would reach its ultimate test when the P-47 met the last desperate defenses of the collapsing Reich. By early 1944, the Allied air war over Europe had reached a decisive moment. The American 8th Air Force, once battered and bleeding from daylight raids, was ready to strike back with overwhelming strength. At the heart of this new offensive stood the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, heavier, deadlier, and flown by pilots hardened by a year of relentless combat. The Luftwaffe, though still dangerous, was beginning to fracture under the strain. Its elite Jagdgeschwader units had been whittled down, their veteran pilots replaced by young men with only a few hours of training. What followed was not just a series of battles, but a systematic dismantling of Germany's air defense system, one in which the Thunderbolt would play a brutal, defining role. It began with Operation Argument, better known as Big Week, February 20th to 25, 1944. For 6 days, the Allies hurled thousands of bombers at the Reich's industrial heart: Leipzig, Regensburg, Augsburg, and Schweinfurt. The goal was to cripple aircraft production and lure the Luftwaffe into open battle. The Germans took the bait. Waves of Bf-109s and Fw-190s climbed into the freezing air to intercept. But this time the bombers were not alone. Hundreds of P-47s and newly arriving P-51 Mustangs swept ahead of the formations, scouring the skies. The air above Germany turned into a chaos of contrails, gunfire, and tumbling wreckage. The P-47s excelled in the maelstrom. Flying in loose Zemke fan formations, they engaged the enemy not defensively, but offensively. Diving from higher altitude, they attacked German fighters as they climbed toward the bombers. The sheer speed of the Jug's dive, sometimes exceeding 500 mph, gave it the element of surprise. Its 850 caliber guns chewed through Luftwaffe formations, leaving spiraling trails of smoke in the thin, icy air. By the end of Big Week, German losses were catastrophic. Hundreds of fighters destroyed, and more irreplaceable pilots gone. The Reich's air defense network was permanently weakened. For the Thunderbolt pilots, Big Week was a vindication. Proof that their flying tank could dominate even in the Luftwaffe's home skies. Robert S. Johnson, one of the leading aces of the 56th Fighter Group, later recalled the sense of control. "We owned the altitude. We could choose when to fight and when to leave." In the months that followed, the Luftwaffe's decline accelerated. Each engagement bled them of experience. Each destroyed airfield robbed them of recovery time. By spring, the P-47's role began to expand beyond the air-to-air war. The invasion of Normandy loomed, and the Allies needed to cripple German logistics before D-Day. The Thunderbolt's massive frame, once seen as a liability, now became its greatest strength. It could carry 500-pound bombs under each wing, along with rockets and long-range fuel tanks. Fighter groups that once escorted bombers now became fighter bombers, striking bridges, trains, and convoys with deadly precision. In May 1944, the 362nd and 365th Fighter Groups began systematic attacks on rail hubs in northern France. They dove on marshalling yards, strafed locomotives, and bombed bridges to isolate the invasion zone. Pilots flew multiple sorties a day, returning to bases in England with their aircraft riddled with holes but still flyable. The Thunderbolt's toughness became legendary. Crews would patch holes overnight, replace engine panels, and the same aircraft would thunder back into the sky the next morning. The Germans, already struggling with fuel shortages, found their transport network collapsing. Supply lines were shredded, reinforcements delayed, and armored divisions immobilized. Reports from the German army in France lamented constant attack from fighter bombers. No rest, no movement by day. The Luftwaffe tried to respond, but each counterattack cost them dearly. The Thunderbolt's pilots no longer feared interception. They welcomed it. The Jug could dive through flak, strike, and escape before German fighters could even organize. By June 6, 1944, D-Day, the transformation was complete. The skies over Normandy were Allied territory. Waves of P-47s roamed above the beaches, smashing gun positions, tanks, and supply trucks. They became the hammer that supported the Allied advance, responding within minutes to calls from ground units. Pilots like Major Mac McKee described the eerie sight of French villages vanishing in dust and flame beneath their wings, their attacks so close that shrapnel sometimes hit their own aircraft. The P-47 had become the embodiment of battlefield air power, fast, merciless, and ever-present. For the Germans, it was a nightmare without end. Columns that tried to retreat by day were annihilated. Armor hidden under trees was revealed by the Jug's pilots, who learned to spot tire tracks or shadows as clues. The Luftwaffe could only watch, grounded by fuel shortages and Allied dominance. By the end of the summer, the once mighty air arm that had terrorized Europe in 1940 was fighting for survival on its own soil. But the true test of the P-47's power and endurance, and the breaking point for the Luftwaffe, would come as the war turned toward Germany itself, and as the Thunderbolt's mission shifted from victory to vengeance. Autumn 1944. The air over Western Europe vibrated with the constant growl of engines. The Allies had crossed the Seine, liberated Paris, and now pressed toward the German frontier. The Luftwaffe, once the master of the sky, was a shadow of its former self. Yet even cornered, it remained dangerous. From hidden airfields carved into forests and camouflaged under netting, squadrons of FW-190s and Me-109s waited for their chance to strike. But above them, day after day, the roar of the Thunderbolt returned, relentless, patient, and merciless. The P-47 had now become a different kind of weapon. It was no longer fighting for air superiority. That battle had already been won. It was fighting to erase what remained of Germany's ability to resist. Each morning began the same way. Low cloud cover, the smell of fuel, engines warming on the dispersal pads, pilots huddled around briefing maps lit by dim lanterns, listening as commanders marked rail lines, supply dumps, and bridges. The orders were short and cold: destroy, disrupt, deny. They climbed into their aircraft, the massive radial engines coughing to life, propellers slicing through mist. The sound built to a chorus of thunder as they lifted into the gray sky. Flying in pairs or small formations, the jugs hunted across a shattered landscape. At treetop level, they followed the snaking lines of the German retreat. Columns of trucks, horse-drawn carts, and tanks crawling east. The P-47's 8 Brownings ripped through convoys with the precision of a scalpel and the violence of an artillery strike. Pilots spoke of the uncanny silence just before an attack, followed by an eruption of noise so intense that it drowned out thought. They could feel the vibration of the guns through the control stick, smell the cordite seeping into the cockpit. Then came the fire. Orange blossoms blooming along the road, black smoke curling into the cold sky. Each mission was a mixture of triumph and terror. The flak was everywhere. German anti-aircraft batteries, desperate and furious, filled the air with shells. Explosions bracketed the Thunderbolts as they dove and twisted through the black puffs. A hit could tear a wing apart, but more often, the jug absorbed the punishment. Pilots returned with gashes along the fuselage, missing panels and shattered control surfaces. Mechanics would run to greet them, shaking their heads in disbelief as they counted the holes. The jug always came home. One mission in November 1944 stood out across the 9th Air Force. A squadron of Thunderbolts from the 365th Fighter Group, known as the Hell Hawks, intercepted a German convoy retreating near the town of Düren. The weather was terrible: sleet, fog, low visibility. But radar and ground spotters guided them in. At 2,000 feet, the pilots saw the road glinting with the movement of steel. They dove in pairs, rockets streaking ahead, bombs falling in arcs of smoke. Within minutes, the entire valley was an inferno. Trucks burned, ammunition dumps exploded, and the road vanished under a column of black fire. When they turned for home, not a single German vehicle remained intact. That was the new face of air power. Destruction so swift and absolute that it seemed impersonal. The Luftwaffe tried to answer. In December, during the Battle of the Bulge, German fighters appeared in force once more. The surprise counteroffensive threw the Allies off balance, and for a brief time, the skies filled again with dueling contrails and cannon fire. But the Thunderbolt was ready. Its pilots, veterans now, met the attack with ruthless efficiency. When fog cleared on December 24th, waves of jugs swarmed over the Ardennes, hitting bridges, roads, and fuel depots that fed the German push. The offensive stalled, not just from ground resistance, but from starvation of supply, a victory won as much by air power as by infantry. By early 1945, the war's final act had begun. The Rhine lay ahead, and beyond it, the heart of Germany. The Luftwaffe's fuel reserves were nearly gone, its pilots half-trained, its airfields shattered. But the Thunderbolts flew on, escorting, bombing, strafing until resistance crumbled completely. In March, near Remagen, they attacked the bridges over the river, clearing the way for Allied engineers to build the crossings that would carry armies into the Reich itself. By now, even German civilians recognized the sound of the jug. Farmers fled at its approach. Soldiers abandoned vehicles and scattered into ditches. The toy plane that once drew laughter from confident commanders had become their daily nightmare, a machine that ruled the air, the roads, and the very rhythm of the war. The P-47 Thunderbolt had done more than survive the ridicule of its birth. It had rewritten the rulebook of aerial warfare, and as the smoke of the collapsing Reich rose over the horizon, the jug still thundered above, relentless, unstoppable, the iron echo of a world that was burning to its end. When the guns finally began to fall silent in the spring of 1945, the legacy of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was written across the ruins of Europe. What had begun as an experiment in brute force engineering ended as one of the most decisive air weapons of the Second World War. The Luftwaffe was shattered, its aircraft destroyed, its pilots lost, its spirit broken. German commanders who had once laughed at the fat American now studied reports filled with dread. Records of entire convoys annihilated, airfields erased, and fighter wings decimated before they could even climb into combat. The Thunderbolt, once doubted, had helped drain the Luftwaffe of its final strength. Between 1943 and 1945, P-47 pilots flew over 500,000 combat sorties in the European theater. They destroyed nearly 4,000 enemy aircraft in the air and tens of thousands on the ground. In France, Belgium, and Germany, railway lines lay twisted, fuel depots burned, and columns of armor were reduced to smoking wrecks. The 8th and 9th Air Forces credited the Thunderbolt with crippling German mobility before and after the D-Day landings, ensuring that Wehrmacht divisions could never reach the front in time. Every train that failed to arrive, every tank that ran dry of fuel, was a victory purchased by the endless roar of those radial engines above. The price was high. More than 3,500 Thunderbolts were lost in combat operations, many to flak, some to weather, others simply to the wear of flying daily into war. Yet the survival rate of pilots was far higher than in any comparable fighter. Veterans spoke of being hit, sometimes dozens of times, and still bringing the jug home. It earned a reputation as a machine that forgave mistakes and absorbed punishment. Pilots said you could feel it taking care of you. Heavy, solid, alive. That reliability bred a fierce loyalty. Many who transitioned later to the sleeker P-51 Mustang admitted that, for sheer confidence in surviving, nothing matched the P-47. For the Luftwaffe, the consequences were irreversible. By 1944, fuel production had collapsed under the weight of Allied bombing, much of it guided by P-47 reconnaissance and escort missions. Training schools were shut down or destroyed, and inexperienced boys were thrown into cockpits to face veteran Allied pilots. The German Air Force, which had once been the spearhead of the Blitzkrieg, became an exhausted shield, riddled with holes. Its leaders, from Göring downward, watched as the Reich's proudest weapon withered under the storm of American air power. On the Allied side, confidence soared. Fighter groups that had started the war as defensive escorts now ruled the skies as offensive juggernauts. The P-47's evolution from high-altitude escort to low-level strike aircraft had transformed air strategy itself. Generals began to integrate close air support as a standard component of ground operations. The concept of air-ground coordination, once considered experimental, became doctrine. The Thunderbolt had proven that the modern battlefield was no longer confined to the ground. By the time the Allies crossed the Rhine, German soldiers no longer needed orders to fear the sound of aircraft engines. The deep rumble of the P-47's radial had become a psychological weapon in its own right. Reports from German divisions repeatedly mentioned the terror of Jabos, the slang for Jagdbomber or fighter bomber. Soldiers refused to move by day. Supply columns waited for nightfall, and even panzer crews abandoned tanks rather than risk daylight travel. In the end, it wasn't only bombs and bullets that broke the Wehrmacht, it was exhaustion and fear. The Thunderbolt had done its work. It had stripped Germany of the ability to fight, stripped the Luftwaffe of the will to resist, and stripped the myth of German air invincibility from history. Yet even as victory drew near, the men who flew it knew that war had changed forever. The skies they once owned were already shifting toward a new age, of jets, of speed, of the next unknown. But for one final season of fire, the P-47 ruled the air with unmatched fury and strength. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had earned a reputation that few aircraft in history could match. It was not the fastest, nor the most elegant, but it was indestructible, the embodiment of industrial power turned into flying steel. Its contribution to victory was immense, yet its glory was measured not only in kills, but in the quiet arithmetic of destruction. The Thunderbolt had become the hammer that broke the infrastructure of the Reich. Trains, bridges, fuel depots, and columns of retreating men all fell under its relentless assault. It had delivered more tonnage of bombs than any other single-engine Allied fighter of the war. Official reports from the 9th Air Force estimated that Thunderbolts destroyed more than 9,000 locomotives, 86,000 railway cars, and 6,000 armored vehicles. Though wartime claims were often inflated, Post-war analysis confirmed the devastation was real. Entire rail networks paralyzed, cities starved of supplies, divisions stranded without fuel or ammunition. In just a few short months, the Jug had achieved what no army could. It had rendered the enemy's movement impossible. The Luftwaffe, drained of fuel and men, could do nothing to stop it. By early 1945, German aircraft seldom rose to meet them. The airfields themselves had become targets, blackened craters where once proud squadrons had stood. Pilots, reflecting in later years, often spoke not of the thrill of combat, but of its cost. Many had spent months strafing roads filled with enemy troops and refugees alike. The line between soldier and civilian blurred beneath their guns. They knew the war demanded such ruthlessness, yet they carried the memories long after victory. Lieutenant Colonel Walker Bud Mahurin once wrote that he could still hear the sound of his own guns long after the engines were silent, a reminder that every triumph in the sky had its echo on the ground. For the Americans and their allies, however, the Thunderbolt became a symbol of something larger, a machine that represented the triumph of endurance over elegance, of power over fragility. Engineers who studied the wrecks of downed P-47s marveled at how much punishment they had taken. Wings riddled with holes, engines shot through, tail sections shredded. And yet, many had brought their pilots home. That resilience inspired not just faith but affection. Crews painted names and nose art across the fuselage. Little Chief, Razorback, Sleepy Time Gal. Each plane carried a piece of its pilot's personality, turning the cold machinery of war into something deeply human. Even after the war, the Thunderbolt story didn't end. It served in air forces across Europe and the Pacific for years to come, with France, Italy, and even newly liberated nations rebuilding their strength on its back. In Korea, its ground attack legacy lived on through its successor, the F-84 Thunderjet, another Republic creation that carried the same design philosophy: strong, heavy, survivable. The lessons learned from the P-47, ruggedness, adaptability, firepower, would echo through jet designs for decades. But perhaps its greatest legacy was the strategic truth it revealed: that wars are not won only by technology or bravery, but by endurance. The P-47 was not born perfect. It was improved, refined, and reimagined in the crucible of battle. Every mission taught its pilots and engineers something new, and through that evolution, it became the instrument that broke the enemy's will. In an age defined by speed, the Thunderbolt proved that strength still mattered, that durability could be its own form of brilliance. By the time peace settled over Europe, the once mocked toy plane had become a legend. The fields and towns that lay in its shadow bore silent witness to its power. To the Allied soldiers advancing beneath it, the sound of its radial engine was the sound of survival. To the enemy, it was the voice of inevitability, the sound of war coming to an end. And when the last P-47s finally fell silent on their home runways, streaked with oil and powder burns, the men who climbed down from their cockpits knew they had flown not just a machine, but a miracle of iron and will, the aircraft that had turned laughter into fear, and fear into victory. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt is not merely one of machines and battles. It is a lesson in underestimation, perseverance, and transformation. When it first appeared, even Allied pilots doubted it. It was too heavy, too loud, too unlike the graceful fighters that defined the early war. Yet war has a way of revealing truth through endurance. What looked clumsy on the runway became unstoppable in the sky. The Thunderbolt proved that power, resilience, and adaptability could achieve what speed alone could not. It was not designed to be beautiful. It was designed to win. In the chaos of Europe's skies, it stood as the silent counter-argument to German arrogance. It defied every expectation and rewrote the rules of aerial warfare. Its engineers had built it to survive, but in surviving it became something more, a symbol of relentless determination. Each mission it flew told the story of an evolving war, from defensive escort to offensive dominion, from protector of bombers to destroyer of armies. The laughter of its critics had long since faded, replaced by the hum of fear in the hearts of those who faced it. To the men who flew it, the jug was more than metal and rivets. It was a companion, a fortress, a lifeline. They trusted it with their lives, and it carried them through fire and flak, through terror and triumph. Its deep-throated roar became the sound of Allied momentum, of an unstoppable tide that would not be turned. Today, when a restored Thunderbolt rumbles to life at an air show, its voice still echoes across generations. It speaks of a time when courage met invention, when ordinary men climbed into extraordinary machines to decide the fate of nations. The P-47 was not the fastest nor the sleekest, but it was perhaps the truest expression of endurance. The aircraft that proved that strength, not perfection, wins wars. And somewhere, across those same quiet European fields it once scorched, the wind still carries its echo, the sound of thunder that changed history.